Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad you joined in this afternoon for our discussion today. Welcome to the Policy Forum on Sustainability and Trade and Climate, Coherence and External Implication of the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is the final session of a broader Policy Forum series titled Sustainable Trade in the Making, Coherence and Pluralism in an Open, Green, Digital and Geopolitical Agenda. My name is Simon Otto. I'm a researcher here at the Brussels School of Governance, working on EU and international climate policy, and I will be moderating today's session. In this broader Policy Forum series, in a total of 8 events, we have taken stock of the efforts of the current European Commission over the past 5 years to make trade more sustainable and furthermore discuss priorities for the upcoming Commission. The previous sessions have thereby focused on a very broad range of topics, in particular discussing the interlinkages between trade and critical raw materials, environment, digitalization, geopolitics, migration, agriculture, and development. And today, in the final session, we will discuss the interlinkages between sustainable trade and climate, by particularly focusing on how the political implications of the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And furthermore, we will reflect a bit more on the broader EU's response to the rising geopolitics in trade. Just a few words on the housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to write them in the chat. If you're joining online, we will take them up towards the end of the session. And as you might notice, we will be recording the first part of the session, meaning the interventions by the speakers and the moderated discussion, but we will not record the Q&A, so do feel encouraged to ask all the interesting questions then. Today's session, I will first provide a few words on what the CBAM actually is to set the discussion. Then I will introduce the speakers, followed by their intervention. Then we will have a moderated discussion, followed by a Q&A. So the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or the CBAM, was introduced as a part of the European Green Deal. And what it will do is will apply a carbon price to the embedded emissions of carbon-intensive imports into the European Union. It will apply to the imports of cement, iron, and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. So those goods that really produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions when they are produced. At the same time, next to the introduction of the CBAM, the European Union will phase out the allocation of free allowances for these industries, with the aim to accelerate their decarbonization over the next years. However, this will make the production of emission-intensive goods more expensive, thus incentivizing industries to decarbonize, leveling the playing field between carbon-intensive and carbon-free basic materials. And the CBAM sort of is the EU's tool to avoid that these emission-intensive industries, now subject to a higher carbon price, will relocate to areas with no carbon pricing policies, which would be called so-called carbon leakage. And through the CBAM, basically, the EU ensures that domestic production and imports, so farm production, are subject to the same carbon price, leveling the playing field between domestic and foreign production. The CBAM has been enforced since January of this year, but originally only through a transitional period of 2 years, where importers only have to declare embedded emissions but do not have to pay the carbon price yet. This will take place from 2026 onwards, when the Commission will, or the European Union will slowly phase in the CBAM price from until 2034, in parallel to the phase out of free allowances of the impacted sectors. While this is ultimately a tool to advance decarbonization within the European Union of these industries, it will also impact the production of emission-intensive industries outside the European Union if they export these goods to the European Union. Now, they're also subject to the EU's carbon price, meaning that if they're emission-intensive, this will make them more expensive and hence less competitive on the European market. On the one hand, this might be a tool to actually incentivize or drive climate ambition outside the European Union, both in terms of other countries adopting carbon pricing, but also of industries decarbonizing themselves. However, this externalization of the carbon price also poses significant economic and political challenges to these countries, as they sometimes do not have the means or the policies to sort of counteract the CBAM. And accordingly, there has been a lot of international opposition and pushback against the CBAM, And to further discuss this matter, we will today focus on this external dimension of the CBAM, focusing in particular on the political implications on the EU's trading partners. What are the challenges they're facing? How have they reacted? How are they preparing for the CBAM? And then maybe also looking at some solutions, how the EU can maybe address these challenges. And to discuss this topic, I am very happy to be joined by an excellent panel today here in the room and online. And I now have the pleasure to introduce them. First, we have Karel de Gucht, President of the Brussels School of Governance and former Commissioner for Trade. And he also initiated the Sustain Lecture Series under the title Sustainability and Trade, the European Narrative, which we had last year and basically preceded this lecture series. Next, we have Canan Nilferdor joining online. She's the Deputy Permanent Delegate of Turkey to the European Union and has previously worked in the Turkish Ministry of Trade. Also very great to have you here. Next, we have Professor James Nedumpara. He's the head of the Center for Trade and Investment Law at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, which was established by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry by India. And he has previously also advised the government on international trade, investment, and dispute settlement matters with regards to the WTO. So also very glad to have your insert here today. Then next to me in the room, we have Nicole Bertolini. She's Senior Policy Advisor at the American Chamber of Commerce to the European Union, where she's focusing on trade and customs and trade facilitation, as well as the transatlantic relationship between the US and Europe. So also very great to have you here. And then finally, last but not least, we have Claudia Azevedo. She's a policy analyst at Europe Jacques Delors, where she's working on greening the EU's trade policy, focusing on the trade, environment, development triangle. And together with colleagues, she recently published a very interesting paper on how we can turn CBAM into a green development tool. So without further ado, I will now hand over the floor to the panelists. And I'd first like you, Canan, to start with your intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your kind introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today with you, with the distinguished panelists, and with the distinguished faculty and students of the Brussels School of Governance. I also would like to thank you for the organization of this event and inviting me and giving the opportunity to share with you the views on Turkish views on CBAM as not only an important trade partner of the EU, but also a customs union partner and a candidate country. As it will be discussed in this panel from public, academic, and business perspectives today, the global economy is going through a major transformation driven by the fight against climate change. And the EU is at the forefront of this transformation with its Green Deal, introducing several policy tools with decarbonisation and circular economy objectives. CBAM, I believe, is one of the most discussed EU initiatives among the others that have been introduced within the context of the European Green Deal. From the very beginning, it has drawn great attention. The Green Deal discussions proceeded for some time almost through CBAM. In my view, there are several reasons for that. First, it was one of the very first proposals introduced by the EU under the European Green Deal with the definition of climate instrument rather than trade instrument. But at the same time, it may be considered, and it was considered, the first major policy tool to impact international trade and global value chains. Second, it covered outstanding energy-intensive sectors like steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizer, or electricity, whose their own production process are the most associated with the high carbon emissions and also cross-cutting many areas of agricultural and industrial production. But most importantly, the cross-border carbon pricing, which has been discussing within the academia since the late 90s, became a reality with CBAM. CBAM is the first ever design and implementation of a carbon burden adjustment. It turns embedded emission in products to a new cost factor in international trade. With the full implementation of the CBAM in 2026, there will be financial requirements on the EU borders for the producers and exporters of the CBAM products. And this made, I believe, the need to transform the production process, energy sources, and the procurement policies much more visible and inevitable. Producers of the CBAM products now need to lower the emission intensity of their goods to maintain their competitiveness. And Turkey having highly integrated economic relation with the EU through the customs union is following very carefully the EU policies aiming decarbonisation and circular economy objectives. In fact, Turkey's approach towards all initiatives introduced under the European Green Deal, including CBAM, is quite similar and has a number of important aspects. The first is to secure the compatibility of these initiatives, including CBAM, with our bilateral agreements with the EU, most particularly with the customs union and the free trade agreement covering coal and steel products. Their compatibility with the rules and principles of the multilateral trading system is also important. The good functioning of the customs union is a shared responsibility under the customs union decision. As most of the CBAM products fall under the scope of the customs union, we need to be careful to protect the free circulation of goods, which is the main principle governing the EU-Turkey bilateral trade. The second aspect I can mention is that bilateral trade in CBAM products is substantial between the EU and Turkey, and we need to protect and further develop this well-established integration. When we look at the bilateral trade in CBAM products, we see that the EU is the largest trade partner for Turkey, but at the same time, especially in steel, aluminum, and cement products, there is an interdependence between the parties. In fact, although CBAM products constitute a relatively small part of the EU's total imports from the world, still accounts for an important amount of exports of several countries, including Turkey. Turkey had a share of 9.5% in EU's total imports of CBAM products, and this accounted for more than 13% of Turkey's total exports to the EU in 2023. Furthermore, the CBAM is likely to be extended to other sectors, especially downstream sectors using CBAM products, and this is potentially multiplying its impact both in our bilateral and international trade. In other words, CBAM has a potential to alter the global production, trade, and consumption patterns in energy-intensive sectors when fully implemented. Therefore, we would like to see the implementation of CBAM as initially envisaged will constitute a stepping stone for a new sustainable international trade order, but not a stumbling block in international trade, creating additional financial and administrative costs, especially for the SMEs. This would very much depend in our understanding on whether and how the current discriminatory aspects of CBAM will be addressed. In our understanding, they include the differences in terms of scope of CBAM and ETC, the incentives afforded exclusively to high-performing producers, and the dual cost and administrative burdens stemming from the verification and the reporting requirements. In the case of Turkey, the extent and depth of the collaboration with the EU for preserving the free movement of goods will be critical for the functioning of the customs union. Third, in addition to its actual and potential impact on our trade, CBAM itself is the EU legislation, and legislative alignment is the core of not only the candidacy, but also the customs union. Therefore, it is inevitable for us to actively engage with the EU on CBAM, as it is the case for all areas under the European Green Deal, since they will transform the EU single market and have direct implications on the good functioning of the customs union, along with its dynamic legislative alignment requirements. With this understanding, since the very beginning of introduction of the CBAM, we have been following the developments closely, consulting with the Commission, raising our concerns and questions both at technical and political level, trying to take place in the relevant technical working groups, giving our inputs in order for them to be reflected in the EU legislation, implementation, and guides to the extent possible. The fourth aspect As it is the case in all areas under the European Green Deal, it is crucial to strengthen the cooperation with the EU as well as our other trade partners regarding CBAM. And I also need to mention that financial support and cooperation is also very important, as it is the case all Green Deal areas which require transformation, for the transformation required for the decarbonization. The EU from the very beginning is saying that we can only solve the global threat of climate change by working with international partners. The EU also says no one should be left behind in this process and argues that the European Green Deal already sets a positive example in this regard. Therefore, we are expecting stronger and concrete commitment from the EU to support our efforts in this regard. Maybe in conclusion, I would like to refer shortly Turkey's own agenda and goals towards green transformation, with the understanding that green transformation both poses challenges and at the same time also generates opportunities for innovation, industrial development, and jobs growth. In this respect, I can mention that we have ratified the Paris Treaty, set an ambitious target of achieving net zero emissions by 2053, and published a comprehensive Green Deal action plan in 2021, almost simultaneously with the Fit for 55 package to steer our economy towards sustainability. In line with the Green Deal action plan, we established a number of working groups with the fellow ministries that provide us platform to discuss and coordinate policy actions necessary to reach our objectives. The low carbon growth strategies for emission-intensive sectors and the green growth technology roadmaps were published to guide private sector in their investment decisions. Our intense work towards adopting the climate law, national carbon pricing arrangements, and establishment of an emission trading system in Turkey are currently underway. This will contribute providing resources for financing the green transition as well as reducing the CBAM financial adjustment for our products. With the EU, on the other hand, under the high-level dialogue on climate, we have established two working groups with the namely climate adaptation and emission trading system, and we are working under these working groups with the colleagues in the Commission. Also under the high-level dialogue on trade, which will have its first meeting in a couple of days in Brussels, we have made the green transition and transition a standing and positive agenda item of cooperation with the EU, with special emphasis on CBAM. Actually, this has been my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions afterwards, I would be happy to try to respond them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Very interesting to see how it impacts the relationship between Turkey and Europe, but also how you've been starting to prepare for the CBAM in Turkey. Next, I would like to turn to you, Professor Nedum Paraf, to see how has been the CBAM received in India and how has India been preparing them? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope that I'm audible.
Yes, we hear you very well.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Simon Otto, and all the distinguished participants and other attendees at this very important programs. I would like to thank and congratulate the Brussels School of Governance for organizing a discussion on a very timely topic. So I will be focusing on India's position with respect to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and also in relation to the kind of various efforts taken by India with respect to its own decarbonization goals. So for India, we have actually looked at this particular issue with a huge amount of skepticism, in the sense that the European Union CBAM measure is actually trying to actually make the European standard apply to all its international trading partners as well. And this particular scheme has already come into effect from October 2023 and is now in the transition phase. The CBAM rules apply to all EU registered companies importing specified goods from third countries. And the first phase of this particular measure covers 6 sectors, which has already been outlined. One is aluminum, the second is iron and steel, then we have cement, hydrogen, fertilizer, and electricity. So when it comes to the CBAM measure, India's overall concern is that from an international trade law point of view, any kind of a process and production method which actually discriminates a product on this particular basis is actually a discriminatory measure. Although this particular debate has undergone certain changes in the last 2 decades, the basic assumption and the understanding is that the PPMs, or the process and production methods, cannot be used in order to distinguish products which are otherwise similar. And in any case, I think India's position has been that in the case of CBAM, every country has got its own decarbonization goals. And sometimes these decarbonization goals are actually prepared and set based upon its own sensitivities and priorities. So for instance, in the case of India, the decarbonization goal is actually identified as 2070. But whereas in the case of the European Union, the goal is actually different. And the European Union is also introducing something called Fit for 55. So that means there are expedited targets which have to be met within a short period of time. So the larger concern seems to be that in the context of the CBAM measure, especially the developing countries will have to bear the brunt. But having understood that position, India has also been arguing that when it comes to climate change, there has to be a multilaterally coordinated approach. If every country takes a unilateral approach to resolving some of the common concerns of the mankind of the planet, then we will have got disparate regimes. And the disparate regimes will definitely result in discrimination and sometimes tit for tat trade measures as well. So what we actually require at the moment is basically cooperation. So having given that particular assumption, let me get back to India's specific measures. So far as India is concerned, out of the 6 sectors mentioned, the most important sectors are aluminum and iron and steel. And within within these 2 sectors, the most important tariff headings are HS76, that is actually aluminum, and HS72 and 73. If you really look at the market, it basically accounts for 34% of India's export in the case of aluminum and 66 in the case of iron and steel. So starting October 2023, the importers must submit quarterly reports on the embedded emissions in their covered products by the 31st of the month after the relevant quarter as per the reporting obligations under Article 35 of the CBAM. So the first reporting requirement has already passed early this year, and the next reporting requirement is also over. So what happens is that the Indian industry definitely is basically adjusting with the reporting requirements. And as of now, there is no obligation on the countries per se. But if the countries do not actually disclose their emissions, then they will be facing consequences in the future. And that is something which India has to definitely avoid. So when we really look at the 2 sectors, as I mentioned earlier, the steel and aluminum and are the 2 important sectors. So if you read the data, India had exported nearly $8 billion of worth steel and $3 billion worth of aluminum to the European Union in 2021-22 period. In 2022-23, that particular figure has actually come down a little bit, but not substantially. So what will happen in the future? In the case of India, the major challenge is that India has a large number of small and medium enterprises whose whose size may not be very big, and these enterprises will also be required to make this kind of reporting requirements to the European Commission. So again, the other important point is that going forward, the exporters will also be subject to the weekly average auction pricing of the European Union emission trading market. Again, there are certain concerns in the sense that for the European industry, the transition or the migration is not so difficult because the ETS system is already in place. Whereas in the case of other countries, especially for a developing country like India, the transition period can be a bit painful in the sense that some of this information may not be very much available, especially when it comes to intermediary products. So in the case of iron and steel, or even aluminum for that matter, even the intermediary products, or what you actually call as the precursors, will also be part of the reporting, the reporting requirement, in the sense that the embedded carbon emission in these products will also have to be submitted as part of the quarterly reporting requirement. So what is actually the government doing in order to address these kind of matters? India has got its own climate change goals. As I mentioned earlier, the government of India launched the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is called the NAPCC, in June 2008, with 8 missions, such as solar mission, a water mission, a mission or enhanced energy efficiency, a green India product, and a strategic knowledge for climate change. India has also submitted its first nationally determined contribution target in 2015. The objective is actually to make sure that the emissions are reduced by 33 to 35% by 2030 from the 2005 level. So in order to achieve these kind of goals, India will have to make sure that 40% of the cumulative electric power is basically taken from non-fossil fuel based energy resources by 2030. How to actually reach these kind of targets? India has been implementing a number of measures. One is actually the Renewable Energy Certificate Scheme called the REC 2010, and another scheme called the Perform, Achieve and Trade. It is called the PAT scheme. It was initially introduced in 2012. Then the government of India is thinking about converging the PAT scheme with the CCTS scheme. The CCTS scheme is actually the 2023 Carbon Credit Trading Scheme. So there are efforts in terms of integrating these schemes with a view to meeting India's overall decarbonization goals. But having said that, I should also mention that at the moment, India doesn't have a carbon tax. And these kind of mechanisms are actually in the process of being designed, and it will take a bit of time. But in the meantime, the government will have to make sure that at least an equivalent regime is actually introduced within India. So when we think about some of the major concerns, if you really look at the CBAM regulation, there is a provision for equivalence. So if a carbon tax is actually paid in a country, paid in the country of exportation, then there is a mechanism in order to take into account or provide equivalence or recognition for that particular system. But in the absence of a system, many countries, including India, will have to actually face the brunt. And that is a major challenge. First of all, you have to introduce a system that will take into account the concerns, especially of the small and medium enterprises. Again, another concern is that when this CBAM measures actually come into effect, there is also a possibility of some of the industries getting relocated to other countries. For instance, the European Union. Especially the European Union's main argument is that the introduction of the Green Deal, the Fit for 55 scheme, etc., will actually result in shifting of the industry from the European Union to other countries in what they actually refer to as a carbon leakage. But there is also a possibility that once this scheme actually becomes fully functional, and if the coverage of the scheme is going to be expanded, then sometimes the industries from the developing countries can also shift to the European Union, because the European supplies can actually be sourced from their overseas company units. So that is a possibility which I think will have to be dealt with multilaterally or maybe bilaterally for that matter. The last point which I want to mention here is that India is actually engaged in a process of bilateral trade negotiation with the European Union. The 8th round of the free trade agreement negotiation actually happened last week in Brussels. So when market access discussions are happening, there is actually a fear and anxiety that the introduction of the CBAM measures on 6 products and with the possibility of expansion or coverage to other sectors will mean that some of the negotiated market access opportunity could be impacted in the future. And this is one area where I think certain amount of cooperation and discussion will have to happen between the two countries. And ultimately, the larger point is that the European Union actually required nearly 20 years, after the introduction of the ETS, to come to or to effectively implement a CBAM kind of a mechanism. And for other countries, this actually may require a longer period of time. So from a multilateral point of view, we know that the climate change concerns are addressed through multilateral agreements. The most important is actually the Paris Agreement. And within the Paris Agreement, as most of you know, there is actually the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So in the sense that every country has been given time in order to determine their own decarbonization goals. So what will actually happen once the CBAM measures are unilaterally imposed? So what is lacking, perhaps, in my opinion, is that a greater amount of cooperation between European Union and its trading partners. And also the concerned industries, especially the small and medium enterprises, will have to be provided longer time periods, perhaps better technology in order to overcome these challenges. And again, another important point is that although the CBAM measure is actually mirroring the ETS system, for the European industry, the applicable regime will be the ETS system. For the third country exporters, the applicable system will be the CBAM mechanism. Although in terms of the monetary impact, these two systems can actually align, in terms of the reporting requirements, the verification requirements, the default values, etc., there is actually a difference. So that can potentially lead to, maybe trade issues between the European Union and its trading partners. So these are issues which need to be ironed out, discussed, and better addressed during the transition period of time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these remarks. Very interesting, also very interesting insights in what we can focus on in the future from the European perspective. We'll probably get back to that later in discussion, but now I would like to give the floor to Nicole for your opening intervention.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me well. I have a weak voice at the moment. No, thanks a lot, obviously, for having me and for the invite from the Brussels School of Governments. It's obviously an honor to be in such a panel, and it's still interesting that we're still discussing this issue. So it shows how important, especially now in this implementation phase, this discussion is. So I just wanted to give you a little different perspective. I'm not an academic, so I'm going to try just to give you some more concrete inputs probably on what this initiative means on the ground, especially for American companies. But before getting to some details in that sense, let me just clarify where we're coming from and what AmCham EU, the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU, is. To clarify the nature of AmCham EU. So we represent more than 150 companies, US corporates present and highly invested in Europe. So we don't represent the US government, and especially we don't represent their interests just in the US market, but also and especially in the EU market, which means that with respect to this specific topic, we have a pretty interesting nature, like dual nature, let's say, and dual impact actually. Because on one side, as I mentioned, we are heavily invested and present in the EU market. So we are producers here, we have manufacturers here, but at the same time, we also have the other side in the US market. So we have this duality. Plus, we represent a very wide range of sectors, so not just manufacturers, but also carriers, traders, and so on and so forth. So it's really complex also to assess the impact of this tool with respect to our membership, because exactly it really entails a lot of different facets to keep into account. So maybe just to start, obviously, I mean, it's needless to say that when it comes to the US corporates that we represent in Brussels, there is a full commitment, first and foremost, to the green transition objectives. So per se, the objectives that the CBAM is trying to achieve and the issue, the carbon leakage issue that it's trying to solve, is definitely something that US corporates present in Brussels and in the European Union can agree with and can align with. So obviously we do recognize the urgency of what the green transition is, and especially the action on the European Union. They need to move forward with bold choices as it comes to the European Union in order to achieve a lower carbon economy and mitigate climate change. So in that sense, our companies are definitely willing to play a role, a constructive role. and to be active in the European Union, as they have already been for a long time, through research, through investment, as I mentioned, through the development on new and clean tech. But that said, obviously, the CBAM, like as usual, the devil is in the details. So the objective, absolutely, we can agree with, but what the CBAM really means in the details, that's where it starts to get tricky, and it starts to pose what challenges, but also opportunities, obviously, for US companies. I will be happy to go a little more into the details of the challenges, the opportunities that we see already in the Q&A. Just to give you like some very general elements. On the challenges side, obviously, we see a couple of like major issues coming our way. The first one is maintaining competitiveness, obviously, of manufacturing production in the EU as much as in the US as well. Another issue of concern is definitely the impact on trade flows. It has already been mentioned, the impact on global supply chains, global value chains. Our companies are multinationals. They're present in basically any market you can think of, and they're deeply integrated, especially when it comes to the EU and the US market. So obviously the impact on global value chains is at the forefront of our concerns, but also in terms of the retaliation that will potentially come from certain actors, from certain other countries. And as we saw in the past, our companies manage somehow to be always in fire when it comes to retaliation. Also thinking at potentially change in the administration on the US side and how that could impact the discussion with the EU. That's definitely also something that we have in mind. And tensions with partners overall is exactly as I mentioned, the US, but also at WTO level. We are strong believers, obviously, in an international trading system, a rules-based international trading system. So the WTO dimension is certainly something that we do care about. We don't necessarily have an opinion whether this tool is discriminatory or not, but it's definitely something that is worth dealing with also at WTO level. But when it comes to opportunities, because as I mentioned, this is definitely something that the US industry also needs, also wants, especially the companies that we represent. As I mentioned, we are heavily invested in the EU, so everything that helps preserving the level playing field is definitely something that goes in our direction as well, and we do care about, as we are also under the ETS system somehow. And on the other side, I think we see also a very big opportunity with this EU CBAM to start a conversation somewhere else. I mentioned WTO, but obviously the US is something that we keep in mind, how that conversation is going there, starting to exactly explore different methodologies, different approaches in other markets, and start really having a common discussion on that is something that we definitely care about and is an opportunity given by the CBAM. But also when it comes to the US and US companies, we really differ from what we just heard from India and Turkey. The US in this very specific case has potentially a competitive advantage. US companies and manufacturers definitely perform better at this point in time in sense of emissions and like low carbon intensity products. Plus there is little exposure or like lower exposure, let's say, with respect to Europe in those categories of products that have been mentioned. So overall, the impact is limited, and that creates also a very big opportunity for US companies to take advantage of this competitive advantage that it's creating for them. Plus all the incentives that they're getting on the US side, that also definitely helps US companies to take advantage of these business opportunities. So overall, just really to give a couple of additional more technical elements again, we are supportive, but now the issues that we start seeing are really in the technicalities, in the technical details. Just to give you a very quick example in terms of like the reporting, the reports that have been provided, we also as US companies have very, very big challenges, not just with the IT system, that's one thing, but in the access of data in particular, the methodologies to be used, the full values, not the full values, who has to do the declaration, for instance. All these issues basically resulted in around 20% of reports to be actually submitted with respect to the ones that were expected. I think at this point in time is a little higher, the reports that are coming in, but definitely then the question is, what is the quality of these reports? How complete they are? How can you assess that? So that all is a big issue. So maybe just to very quickly conclude on what do we need on our side, yes, companies based in Europe, present in Europe. The first element we call for is coherence and coordination among different policy areas. What we are seeing right now, you heard it a lot, is a sort of overregulation kind of situation that entails a cumulative effect, a cumulative impact as well. CBAM being just one part of the big picture with CSRD, for instance, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSDDD. There's many elements, deforestation, talking about the customs I mentioned as well. Forced labor, there's many initiatives that are coming our way and coming to also the usual suspects. For instance, that customs people and related people, importers, and so on. So that kind of coherence and coordination is absolutely necessary at this point in time in the next commission, which is going to be really about implementation and enforcement. A second point, obviously, as I mentioned, the trade dimension is absolutely key for us. So really try to avoid any kind of trade tensions through, as already mentioned by some colleagues, greater collaboration, cooperation, dialogue, financial also potentially support with trade partners. So really try to mitigate unnecessary impacts on trade. We do need trade for the green transition as well. So creating barriers to that is definitely not going to help. Trade is part of the big picture and is an accompanying measure that we like, a company policy that we definitely need to explore further. And very last element is, as already mentioned, the need for a global consensus. We are going to get nowhere, obviously, with this kind of global challenges if we don't reach a global consensus. So it is great that the EU is giving the law, let's say, starting the conversation, but this is not something that the EU can do alone. You're not going to solve anything. And especially there is need to join forces with not just trading partners, but like-minded countries. Thinking of the US in particular, for us, obviously, transatlantic cooperation is the way to go. It's the very big starting point. Come up with a transatlantic strategy for CBAM, discuss exactly like this equivalence issue that has been mentioned. How can we find potentially different ways to achieve the same objectives? Is the objective is important? Is the way of doing it? All these needs to fit in a common discussion between these two major powers that then are expected to lead, let's say, in this exercise towards the, let's say, formulation of global standards and potentially the formation of a carbon club at a certain point, and a sort of like ensuring as much as harmonization as possible in a global market, also to the advantage, obviously, of companies and to reduce the burden. So I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to get into the details.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points raised as well, and I'm sure we'll touch upon that, some of them later. Now I'd like to give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here. A very interesting discussion so far. So my name is Claudia. I work at Europe Jacques Delors, which is a think tank, a Brussels-based think tank, and we're part of a bigger, we call it a Jacques Delors think tank family. We have a center in Berlin and one in Paris, and we're the last one, and we focus mostly on sustainability issues and the Green Deal. And me in particular, I work at the trade team. For the past year, mainly, we've been focusing primarily on the interplay between trade, environment, but also development, with this third element kind of being understood by pretty much everyone as an afterthought when the Commission designed the Green Deal and some of these measures. So basically assessing the impacts of these measures like the CBAM, but also deforestation and the CSDDD on partner countries, and in particular developing countries in LDCs. And I mean, yeah, everyone said it already, the CBAM had a lot of backlash. Of course, some trading partners perceive it as an opportunity, but some not so much. Faced with this, all of these strong international reactions, recently we published a report, a policy brief, with concrete policy recommendations on how to turn CBAM into green development tool. And in our view, in order to do that, there is a need for effective responses from both sides. So of course, several concerns raised by partner countries are valid and they must be addressed. But in order to turn CBAM into a development tool, there is a need for both an effective response by the Commission and by the EU in general. Step up technical and financial assistance, a more cooperative approach. I mean, I'll go into details there later on, but there's also a need for an effective response by trading partners, because CBAM is here to stay and the features might change. There might some things that will change, the scope will expand. But it's here to stay, will not go anywhere. So it's in the interest of everyone to come up with responses and with measures to mitigate all of these negative impacts that CBAM might potentially have. And in both cases, our starting point is there is a need to have a better understanding of the impacts of the CBAM on partner countries. This will vary depending on the partner country in question. Even within the country will vary depending on the industry and the sector. And the impacts were, I mean, this is also something we see quite common in several, all of these autonomous measures, that the impact assessments were not always very in depth and didn't assess this so much into detail. And I mean, things have changed ever since the CBAM was proposed 2020. So there is a need to look at that, both in terms for the developing countries to respond to CBAM, and also for the EU to provide a targeted response and support to the countries. So in this regard, when it comes to assessing the impacts, we're looking at primarily two things. So exposure to CBAM, to what extent a given country, because of the sectors it has and the biggest interests it has, and the levels of exports is or not more exposed to CBAM. And as a general rule, what we see, and I mean, there is an index online by the World Bank. I mean, there's some flaws, but it's quite comprehensive, where the exposure of countries to CBAM is assessed. Generally speaking, low-income countries are not particularly exposed, with some exceptions. So, I mean, I'm not going to name countries, but like from the top of my mind, Egypt, I know it's there, Kazakhstan is there, and from the low-income countries, Mozambique, which is the paradigmatic example that everyone uses because of the exports of aluminium mainly. But in addition to the exposure to the CBAM, I think it's also very important to look at the vulnerability. So the ability of a country to adapt, and whether, and in this regard, I mean, we can look at several factors. So whether it's easy or not for certain industries to decarbonize because there's renewable energy in place, so there's investment for that in place, or whether there is a carbon pricing in place. And in this case, probably it will be easier because normally countries with carbon pricing, they have already monitoring, reporting, and evaluation processes and systems in place. So I think we need to look at this, at both of these, like exposure and vulnerability. And depending on the level of exposure and vulnerability, countries should be addressed differently, because we talk about the impact of countries, of CBAM on third countries, and we hear a lot on developing countries, but there is no such thing, right? It will depend. And countries like Brazil, for instance, seem to see it as an opportunity because they seem to have a comparative advantage. So in this regard, what we focus primarily on when it comes to developing countries and the response that they can give, we focus primarily on the need to develop country-specific impact assessments. And this would be some, and of course, there are several things that could be put in place. It was said already that Turkey has a Green Deal plan in place. So, I mean, it will vary. But the idea with this country-specific impact assessment would be to look beyond the CBAM, of course, look at the decarbonization strategy of the country, identify opportunities and challenges, and of course see to what extent the CBAM could be used as a springboard for green development and fit in those priorities. And these impact assessments could be a way in which the Commission would support partner countries. So this could be, and this leads me to my second point, which is what can the Commission do? Because as Nicole said, like this is a discussion that has been taking place for over a year now, but this is quite a critical point, because before the definitive period kicks in, the Commission will have to report back to the Council and to the Parliament. And among other things, it will have to assess to what extent the measures that they had in place and basically the CBAM, how it was implemented during the transitional period, impacted LDCs in particular. So this is quite a critical moment in time, and the way the transitional period was presented to all of us was as a learning process. And then when the Commission has more data and the impacts are more assessed and more understood, then measures will be deployed. That said, what can the EU do? So first, look at trading partners differently. So move beyond the one-size-fits-all approach and address trading partners and provide support measures depending on the level of exposure and vulnerability. And we put forward kind of like a pathway, or now a blueprint kind of on how the support can take place without being overly prescriptive. But for instance, for countries with high levels of exposure and high levels of vulnerability, which I mean are somehow the minority, but countries like Mozambique, for instance, the Commission would have to, or the EU, I always talk about the Commission because the implementation falls mainly there, but in the EU should prioritize supporting decarbonizing domestic carbon-intensive industries. So this could be with technical support, but probably in these cases, chances are financial support would also be needed. Then for countries, for instance, with high levels of exposure and low levels of vulnerability, so in some cases, some developing countries or middle-income countries, some emerging economies as well, maybe financial support will be less required, but maybe then the focus should be on the need to provide technical support, for instance, to set up their own carbon pricing, or to train exporters and businesses on how to measure emissions and anticipate already the expansion of the scope. Then for countries with low level of exposure and high levels of vulnerability, so countries, some LDCs that won't be particularly hit by CBAM, but they might be left behind in this green industrialization race, then there is a need to step up, like climate mitigation and adaptation, and just basically fulfill climate finance commitments. And then last but not least, countries with low levels of exposure and low levels of vulnerability, in these cases, would be particularly important is regulatory dialogues. In this, it falls like the West and for many developed countries. So this is not to say that things are not being done. It's true, like the Commission has several programs in place. Generally speaking, they're spread across programs. So there's the Just Energy Transition, the JETPs. There is bilateral agreement, for instance, with Egypt on green hydrogen. And then in the paper, we explain a bit to what extent these mechanisms that are already in place can be leveraged to facilitate compliance with CBAM. So I can go further into detail later on. But the idea would be to use the mechanisms that are already in place to leverage those, but also to acknowledge that those are not enough. And there more needs to be done. So there is a need for more concrete commitments. In this regard, for instance, the Commission has already a task force on carbon markets. It's been recently announced. I think, as far as I'm aware, is the only mechanism, like the only, really the only mechanism that was created to support CBAM specifically. Everything else is indirectly will support it, but it's not the main goal. And it remains to be seen how it will be implemented in practice. But as far as it was presented to the public, it will focus primarily on helping countries who are interested in setting out their own carbon pricing to do so and ensure alignment somehow with the EU. But there's, for instance, what about technical support to countries that are not close to having carbon pricing in place or don't wish to do so? That's another big question. And last but not least, I mean, everyone seems to have a plan to what to do with CBAM revenues, and I mean, I guess I come here with a plan as well. I mean, this was something that was highly discussed during the negotiations. Parliament tried to put a provision there with a binding obligation to provide technical support. It's not there now. It's in the preamble provisions statement saying that the EU commits itself to support third countries. It's not a binding obligation, of course, so trading partners are left with no guarantee whatsoever whether this will ever happen and when. And CBAM revenues, I mean, the estimates there, it's a relatively modest amount as far as it's, well, there are several studies, but it's around 1 billion, 1.5 billion per year until 2028, 2030. So it's a relatively modest amount, but repurposing these revenues and providing support to third countries would send a big message and would change the perceptions. And I mean, perceptions matter. And if the CBAM at the end of the day, it's a climate measure, then it would be the revenues, it's only fair, that would be used to support decarbonization and green transition and trading partners. I mean, and then if we take a step back and we look at the bigger picture, the emissions come from 2/3 come from developing countries. And well, again, the same way that ETS revenues are channeled to EU businesses, then it's only fair that would go to international trading partners. And then, I mean, the last point I wanted to make is really when it comes to coordination, and Nicole already touched upon it. And I think the CBAM unveils a big problem when it comes to coordination at both international level, I would say, and also at the EU level. And maybe CBAM is not even the one that is most problematic, but there are several. But all of these green trade measures highlight a big. There is a bit of a governance issue at the Commission level, the coordination between services. And I mean, and now I'm not talking specifically with the CBAM, but we see deforestation being led by DG ENV and DAC Sud, leading CBAM, and then DG Grow leading all of these critical raw materials partnerships. And it seems in some cases that the Commission doesn't speak with the same voice. So this is an issue, and I guess it's a lesson learned. And then at the international level as well, because there are some things already in place. There are some forward to discuss carbon pricing and trade and environment issues in general. There is a OECD inclusive, I don't know the name, but exclusive platform on carbon mitigation, something like that. There's the G7 Climate Club, which are basically groups of like-minded countries. And because our smaller groups, they do have the potential to have like, it's easier to reach an agreement or a consensus and to go forward, but to move the conversation forward. But there's still a need to have a discussion at the multilateral level because there are some key players that are missing. And I think this is something that the CBAM showed the world as well, that today is CBAM, but tomorrow we don't know. And several countries are adopting their own measures. There's the IRA, now that there's deforestation, and we don't know what movement will be triggered ever since. And there is a need to have this discussion at international level. And CBAM now is being used somehow as to highlight the gaps, both in when it comes to climate governance and also with trade governance, with countries taking it to COP saying, well, this is not fair because if common with differentiated responsibilities principle, we should be able to set our own levels of ambition. And then countries taking it to the WTO and saying, come on, this is discriminatory. And at the end of the day, I think there is a growing consensus about the need that there is a need to discuss this at international level. Countries seems to disagree where these discussions should take place at the WTO. We want to see a joint, I don't know, a joint organization, a joint effort. I don't know, but I think this is a discussion that it was, it has been there for years, but now it's CBAM really changed. But I'll leave it at that because I know I was already right.
Thank you very much, and we'll try to touch upon that later next to the other issues. But before that, I would like to finally give the floor to Karel for your reflections on the subject.
Well, I will try to concentrate on a number of remarks that have been made by the different people intervening, because I don't have time, I think, for having a long keynote speech, and it wouldn't be very useful either. But let me try to focus on a number of issues that have been raised here. First of all, that we try to impose it unilaterally. That has a remark by several people. It will only come about if the EU imposes it unilaterally. If you don't impose it unilaterally, it will never come about. You can have a lot of discussions internationally. I'm a little bit used to that. I have negotiated for 4 years with the United States on TTIP. To come to the conclusion that it couldn't work, I've discussed for even longer period with India. Finally, it didn't work out because we could not agree on the cutoff price for whiskey. So the whole idea, let's try to get to an international agreement on this, then you better forget it immediately. So the only way to impose it is to do it unilaterally. And the reason that now there is a lot of discussion on this is precisely because we are nearing 2026. That's the reason. Now the preliminary phase, but as of 2026, it will come into force at full speed with a lot of problems. And I will try to touch upon that. That's the reason we are now discussing it. And that's probably also the reason that I'm reading today in the Financial Times, US examine carbon pricing on imports. Just today. It says a report from the Niskanen Center last year found that US industry was much less carbon intensive than some of the world's largest emitters, such as China, India, and Russia, but lagged behind the EU. So that's the reason we are taking the lead, because we are the least carbon intensive block, let's say, which puts our industry, if we don't take measures for that, in an impossible position. I mean, if you don't take measures, then, for example, you won't have a steel industry in Europe anymore within 3 to 5 years. And it's going to completely vanish, And there I know a little bit about, because I'm on the board of ArcelorMittal. So what the situation of the steel industry is. So we do it unilaterally, but of course with the aim that we could get force, let's say, a global consensus, and it starts because it's the first time that the US, Mr. Podesta, have said, look, we should do this. No? Whether it comes about immediately, that's still something else, but this clearly change of position there. Secondly, we should, of course, look at CBAM together with other measures with respect to trade, no? Especially, for example, all the import taxes by the US. No? So it's what are you going to do with these once you have a CBAM? How do you discount them in all this? No? And position will be a little bit different whether it's Mr. Biden that is the next president or it is Mr. Trump. But it won't change that much, because also the Biden administration has been terribly protectionist. The IRA, it's a protectionist measure, nothing more, nothing less, which is putting the European industry in a very difficult position. So there's not that much difference, at least not in that respect, with respect to, let's say, the global security environment. That's something different, of course. So we have to see it together with other measures, and a number of countries are taking protectionist measures. What should the European Union do? And that's the real question. The next one is the problem of the compatibility with the WTO. First remark: does the WTO still exist? That's the real question. Let's say the judiciary system doesn't function anymore, precisely because the United States are refusing to nominate judges. No? It's very difficult to have a tribunal without judges. And then, of course, say, look, it should be WTO compatible, but we are not nominating judges. And, you know, they have also said to the United States that whenever there would be a decision by the WTO, that after the decision, they would decide whether or not they would apply it. So, I mean, the position there of the United States is a little bit strange. So is it WTO compatible? I think the way it is presented now, it is WTO compatible. But I think that as it is presented now, it cannot work. That's the real problem. Because what you are now proposing, what is proposed, is in fact to say, look, you have the ETS, you're going to phase this out and phase in CBAM at the same level. And every month you will fix the price of the CBAM, which will in fact be mirroring the price of the ETS. Now, that doesn't, from an industrial point of view, doesn't make any sense at all, you know. It should be differentiated with respect to the countries that you are targeting. For example, if you were to do this with China, well, they would be very happy, you know, because it wouldn't change anything to the way that they are producing, for example, steel, that it's much cheaper to do it, and then they take measures with respect to climate change, but on the other hand, in certain sectors like aluminium and steel, they are still working with furnaces on the basis of coal, and that's they are even building new installations based on coal, and so that's not a level playing field at all. If you just balance this with let's say replacing the how would I say, giving compensation for the ETS. The loss of ETS free allowances, it doesn't put the European industry in a position that they can compete. The CBAM should be much higher, and which means that you would really compensate the price. Now, if you try to get out of that with international negotiations, I mean, you still have a very long future before you, but in any case you will have that. But certainly it would be really a very interesting thing to look at. So and that's not looked at yet. What should be the level of those CBAMs? So the European industry is in favor of the system, but does not agree on how you put the price on it, and that should be completely different. Vis-à-vis the United States, vis-à-vis India, vis-à-vis China, not to forget Russia, and by the way, Turkey. By the way, Turkey, because if you look at international trade, there is a lot of parallel imports by Turkey, coming from China, coming from Russia. A lot is passing by Turkey because they have a customs union with the European Union, which is of course very advantageous. No? And we are, well, nothing that much is said on that for the time being because of security situations and NATO and so on. But it's obvious that there you have a lot of parallel imports, and in one way or another, you would have to have an answer to that as well. Now, the link with decarbonising. I think the big step that has been made with respect to decarbonising is that it has become an industrial project. It's not any longer a philosophical question, a matter of principles. It's not any longer something academic. It is an industrial project. And that's very important, but it's also very tricky because it means that, for example, in a sector, take steel. No investment in a European steel company is made unless it is aiming at decarbonizing. So a traditional investment in steel doesn't exist anymore. Huh? You have this big investment in Mardik, I mean, just around over the other side of the border with France. Have the problem in Ghent. They have a problem, not a problem, but a possible project in Germany. And it's really about who is going to pay for it. That's what it really is. And if nobody pays for it, then it will simply not happen. Because it's also not feasible. Already now, they are not making any profit anymore in Europe. So the only possibility is that in one way or another, somebody is taking the bill. Can the European Union take the bill? No, that's not very clear. Can it be solved with the CBAM? Well, it depends, of course, what happens with the proceeds of the CBAM, and that's one of the questions you touched upon. I mean, you cannot give it to the developing countries and putting European industry in a position that they simply cannot compete anymore. Yeah. So where do you find this equilibrium between both? That is a very, very difficult question, but it's obvious that no investments are made anymore in industry if they are not focusing on decarbonizing. That in itself is very good. But it also means that you will have to create the conditions that investments can be made. Huh? And in most of cases, I mean, the cases that I know, the private companies cannot simply do it alone. I mean, it would mean that for the next 10 to 15 years, they wouldn't have any profit. Now, how private company can survive without any profit for 10, 15 years, that's not clear either, certainly not when they are listed. I mean, so somewhere there will have to be found money. That's also why the industry in Europe is claiming that the free allowances should continue, if replaced by CBAM, that it would be diversified, and that the proceeds would not come directly to an individual company, but into, let's say, the European fund to make investments in carbon-free production of steel, aluminium, not to forget hydrogen and electricity, by the way. And there, for hydrogen and electricity, there you have a number of developing countries that also imply. Huh? You mentioned, I think, Egypt. No? Yeah. But there are several other ones. Huh? I mean, for example, hydroelectricity. You have the you can produce in Africa all the hydroelectricity for Africa and the larger part of Europe. Huh? You can do that on the basis of the Congo River. So, but there are big investments that nobody can make because the situation is not stable over there. So it is an industrial project, but it's also an industrial project that will vanish and that will collapse if there is no proper financial mechanism to support it. And in the meantime, no investments are made anymore. So then I come to the revenues. Yeah, you're right that we should support the developing countries. But, you know, one of the problems with developing countries is that the bigger developing countries are always mixed, you know. Yeah. For example, China and also India will say we still have hundreds of millions of people that in fact belong to the developing world, but you have also very advanced industries in those countries in China, but also, by the way, in India. So that's the problem. I mean, They are still playing the cards of a developing country, but that, of course, is also very advantageous for their highly developed industries. And how are you going to make that balance? Huh? I mean, that's, by the way, one of the reasons, and the main reason that the WTO has collapsed. Huh? That's the real reason for it. Huh? Because what is China? Is it a developing country or is it a developed country? What about India? It's exactly the same. Yeah? India is very heavily protecting their markets, also their steel market, but they are very advanced in that respect as well. Not to speak about everything that has to see with advanced technologies and software, where you see that all the big American companies have very important campuses, most of them in Bangalore. So these are they are mixed economies, no? And how are you going to make this split? That's something that is of course very important. I think Otto, that I will Simon, excuse me.
No problem.
There was also an Otto in the European Parliament, but there was a former emperor, Otto von Habsburg. So that's not you.
No.
So I think I will keep it to that. So I've tried to touch upon what I see as the tricky points in all this. We should continue the discussion, yes, but on the other hand, Europe should simply do it. It is by saying, look, whatever happens, we are going to do it the 1st of January 2026, that we will have a real discussion. That, of course, will depend on the program of the next European Commission, which will be very difficult, because well, the money will have to be found in the next multi-annual financial framework. And that will be a very, very difficult discussion, because now also you have the Netherlands that ask a payback. And I mean, everybody is going to ask for a payback. And then the question is, of course, who is still going to pay? Huh? So that will be a very, very difficult discussion. And you cannot have a debt service either for Germany or for the Netherlands again, and maybe in France also in a week's time. So we are there also in a turmoil, but the only way to do it is to impose it on our own means and on our own terms. And then, they will have to live up in one way or another, because I mean, it's exactly the same that happened with the REACH. Huh? Everybody was against, we have imposed it, and now everybody is following REACH. Not to say that this is the simplest system that you could invent, that is still something else, but you have to follow it, because we are a big market and there's no other solution. So I apologize for saying this, but the only way to do it is in a unilateral way. But it's very good, Mrs. Bertolini, that now the United States starts understanding that they should do something.
Fine.
But it's attacking some imports, so without the domestic carbon.
It's this administration. Right, thank you very much for these very insightful reflections. I think really pinning down the discussion we have, which is obviously given the complicatedness and complexity of this measure and this tool, and all the interactions it's had with the international climate regime, but also trade, development, and all these things. Of course, not an easy discussion. For those joining online, and please don't hesitate to write any comments in the chat. We're running a bit behind, or we don't have so much time left, so I'll try to address them as we go. I would first like to address a question to Canan and Professor Minumbara, if you're still online. Now that we've sort of discussed, and also coming from deflections from Mr. Dugov just here, that the CBAM is to stay, and it's maybe only way that the EU can go to advance its agenda. Can you, or what is the things that the EU should be doing now in the very short term to help those countries, or help Turkey, help India, but also other countries on how to sort of address its challenges? Also, when keeping in mind, as you rightfully mentioned, Professor, that it will take a long time to build up similar domestic policies as we've seen in the EU, and still the system we have is still not finished, as the example of CBAM rightly shows. So what are the very few tangible things the European Union can do now in a very short time to support those countries struggling to prepare for its impact? And since I think you will have to leave, Shannon, if you're still online, please go ahead first, but please try to keep it short so we can hear some more perspectives from other speakers as well.
Thank you very much, Simon. Indeed, I need to leave in a couple of minutes. Actually, as I mentioned in my presentation, and the many panelists also indicated, the cooperation and cohesion of the policies is very, very important. And, you know, the EU is at the forefront of these initiatives. And as one of the colleagues, one of the panelists said, the CBAM is only one example of the new trend, of the new pattern of the EU legislation. Now, the trade legislation, as far as I see, is now written by the DG MV, not by DG Trade. And the trade legislation of the European Union, I don't want to refer to as a trade legislation, but the product legislation, as we knew earlier, the main idea was the safety of the product. All the EU legislation, all the product EU legislation was saying that if the product, only the safe products can be placed on the EU market. So now these product safety is also very important, but now the EU policy is governing in our understanding the whole supply, production, and consumption patterns. So this really needs cooperation, more consultation with the trade partners. So as far as I see, the main burden, maybe it's not the correct word, but the main responsibility for the good implementation of the new generation EU legislation is on the operators and in the customs authorities. When the reporting requirements of the CBAM were first started last year, we saw that there are many questions, many hesitations, many concerns, both on the operators as well as on the EU customs authorities. They were saying that there is no sufficient instructions, no clear instructions. But so in the implementing period actually is dedicated to maybe solve these kind of issues. And now the colleagues in the Commission and in collaboration with the operators, now they are trying to solve these kind of issues out. But this also shows that the design of these kind of instruments, which includes many stakeholders, should be coordinated, should be more consulted. And as Mr. Commissioner said, the previous Commission, the current Commission has actually managed great job, because in the past 5 years, in the 4 or 5 past years, there was like a tsunami. Every day we have seen a new proposal governing an area. But I think the upcoming Commission will be the executive one. So in the implementation period of CBAM and the other similar kind of EU legislation, I think the EU should listen more its trading partners to better design the implementation. This is the case for us, but I think this is the case for all partners trading with the EU. And this is also very important for us as well, because of the customs union and the legislative alignment requirement, as I mentioned in my presentation.
Great.
And
thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Do you still have anything else to add? Otherwise, I would like to pass on the floor.
Maybe I can only react to what Mr. Commissioner said on the parallel imports. In fact, in our exports to the EU, mostly includes our own production. And we're already facing because of the EU safeguard measures, which have been in force for 6 years now, and now extended to 2 more years. Actually, we are now in difficulty. We are facing major difficulties to exporting to our own production, own steel production to the EU. I will check the figures again, but our steel exports mostly concern our own steel production. So this is what I have to say for the time being. Thank you very much for the organization and invitation. I am very sorry, but I have to leave, as I said earlier. So I wish everybody has a very nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It was very good to have you, and thanks for sticking with us so long despite your next meeting. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes. Then, Professor Nirumpara, I would just like to pass the question also to you. What can the EU do to better support India in preparing for the CBAM, but also maybe accelerating industrial decarbonization in India as such?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Simon. In fact, I was actually, hearing the comments of the president with a great interest. Obviously, I think the impression we are getting is that the European Union is pretty much committed and determined to go ahead with the CBAM measures. And I think, these kind of measures will actually become the norm over a period of time. So I'm not disputing that particular possibility. But the real danger is that the way these kind of measures are actually administered will favor some countries. So in particular, when we think about China, so China has got a much faster transition to a green economy. And especially when we think about the greening of the electricity grid, China is actually, moving pretty fast towards that particular goal. India is slowly going to decarbonize the electricity grid as well, but it will take a bit of time. The problem is that when it comes to some of these, sectors like steel, aluminum, it actually requires a huge amount of capital investment. So for any industry to actually, to replace their existing, productive assets with the new technology will take a bit of time. So what will happen is that in the meantime, the more competitive economies, or maybe the more green economies will actually gain the market share in the European Union, and the other developing countries will slowly lose their market share and eventually be exiting that market. That's a real possibility. So every country is actually doing it. The major problem here is that the pace of transition for green economy is not the same thing. So unless we're able to sort out this issue, the existing or the continuing inequities will persist. You can say the least developed countries or other countries which are actually in the path of becoming a developing country will suffer most than many other developed countries. So that is a particular threat. The second problem is that the ideal situation would have been a global carbon pricing system. So now let me actually highlight a particular problem here. Assuming that India comes up with a carbon tax or an equivalent measure to deal with embedded carbon emission, the price in India cannot be anywhere near the European price. So if I understand correctly, the European carbon price, based on the weekly average auction price, is around 80 euros or 85 euros per metric ton. In India, the price may not be even 10 euros per metric ton. So how can you actually have a proper equivalence regime? Assuming that a developing country has got its own mechanism of dealing with this particular issue, how can you have an equivalence regime? That is a challenging thing. The ideal solution would be to have a global, carbon pricing system based on a differentiated pricing of whatever. That would have been the ideal situation, but I do not know whether we can reach a deal on this particular matter. So that is another issue. The third important issue, which I feel, is that even the European Union, in my opinion, will have to provide for longer transition. So the president actually mentioned that come 2026, this measure will come into effect. And it may likely come into effect. Maybe there could be some challenges or whatever. I'm not ruling out any of these possibilities. But at the same time, for many of these countries to actually comply with this CBAM regulation, the short run will be a major challenge. Obviously, I think the nudge has to be there, but the European Union should be a bit more flexible in this particular matter. Imposing a timeline of 2026 and then facing it, completely facing it by 2034 may not be the right way to go forward. I'm not denying that the nudge factor can be very important in this transition. And especially, my own feeling is that there cannot be any conflict between the domains of trade and climate change, or the domains of international trade, like WTO regime or free trade agreements, and the domains of, COP and other international treaties. Both these, regimes or domains will have to work and exist, coexist or exist peacefully for that matter. Otherwise, what will happen is that all your, commitments are undertaken in any other multilateral environment agreement or a climate change agreement will be completely rendered inutile or redundant for that matter. Because that is actually the danger with a unilateral thing. Of course, they understand that unilateral measures can be very powerful in conveying a message, in basically compelling or coercing countries to make transition to a green economy or to reach a decarbonization goal. But at the same time, the rough edges of this policy will have to be ironed out. The other danger, which I just want to mention, is that, we should not actually enter into a kind of a trade war. What I'm saying is that, think about a situation where European Union comes up with a certain kind of measures, the United States comes up with a tax on, maybe on some of these products, then perhaps it can actually, lead to a global trade war. Of course, there is a subsidy war happening. And the commissioner rightly mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a completely industrial policy measure. And it is a subsidy which is prohibited, at least in terms of the SCM agreement. So in order to avoid these kind of frictions, we have to actually make sure that, the global cooperation will have to happen, maybe at the WTO level or in some other forums for that matter. The other point is that developing countries may not have the kind of competence to come up with a sophisticated measure like the CBAM. Let me tell you, it is very difficult to even read the CBAM regulation and all the implementing regulations. They are very complex documents. The developing countries may not have the capacity. What they will do in turn, they will come up with the blunt measures, maybe like import licensing measures, tariff quotas, tariff restrictions, other kind of blunt measures. So that is why we need to avoid that particular situation from actually, becoming a trade war in the future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See, we are nearing the end of our time. Do you still have some minutes, or do you also have to?
A couple of minutes.
All right. Okay. Then we'll try to keep it short because I still have one question for you each. But yeah, sorry, such an interesting discussion. So it's always difficult to cut it short. First, do you recall we mentioned a bit already that the US might be moving forward with an external carbon tariff as well, and there has been ongoing cooperation between the EU and the US towards sort of forming a club for steel and aluminum. But this could sort of furthermore excavate the challenges even more for developing countries. So how can the two maybe avoid doing that in general? And then also, what can be the role of US business in supporting the transition of industries in developing countries? But
yeah, no, absolutely. First, maybe a very quick word on what the US is doing. Well, first and foremost, this is not news. They've been discussing obviously carbon pricing for quite a long time. The problem is that it's politically toxic, and that will remain. So we can actually start forgetting about a potential CBAM tomorrow. I also struggle to see what are we trying to achieve in the US with the CBAM, since there's no ETS system. And plus, it's a system that is based on incentives. It's a carrot kind of like approach. So is this a level playing field that we're trying to address? I'm really not sure. Is it matching the EU system? Is it an equivalence? That potentially is a different discussion. But exactly to the point, I also have some doubts on whether this equivalence needs to be in the tools that we're using, in the methodologies, in the calculations and whatever, or should it be in the objectives that we are putting ourselves? So this is a little the discussion. So on the US side, exactly now we see a series of legislative bills that are being proposed to Congress with more or less different approaches or not to the EU. We have Podesta, exactly with this task force. Exactly, all this is for us creating a lot of fragmentation risk. Hence, the need to really better coordinate with like-minded countries, the EU being one. And you mentioned exactly global steel and aluminium. There are discussions going on, not just under, for instance, the Trade and Technology Council, which is definitely a very interesting platform for this kind of debate between the EU and the US. But you mentioned, the global sustainable steel and aluminium agreement kind of discussion. Here, exactly, is great. The EU-US, as I mentioned before, take the lead in this, start the conversation, but you cannot have a global arrangement without like that being global, like without including as much as possible certain countries. So I totally understand, for instance, on the unilateral point, sure, it does have an impact. I understand the multilateral as first step is impossible. Hence, exactly, we are pushing for EU-US as a coordination, but that has a very short lifetime. You start a conversation, you do the lot, and then you start already to include as much as possible. At least like-minded countries. Think of Japan. I think of South Korea. Things like Canada. Where is Canada in this discussion? I mean, like that as well. For instance, New Zealand, Australia. Just starting like that. But exactly to your point, what does it mean? Because in this way, the effect is we're creating a carbon club among rich countries.
Yeah.
What does it mean for exactly for developing countries? I think here we can just be creative. Amchamir doesn't necessarily have a position on that, but you can be very creative, especially on the capabilities, competence, financial support. This is something that the EU obviously has to do because they created the issue, let's say, in this sense, they put it there for the first time. So they do have now the responsibility to take care of the implementation, also in third countries. But this is something that you have to pool resources together. It's a responsibility not just of the EU, it's a responsibility of big powers like EU and US together to put together capabilities, to put together financial resources to support, again, these countries and to include them in a discussion since day one as well. Like their perspectives need to be included in the discussion. And it's something that I understand the unilateral approach and impact, as I mentioned, but this is something that you fail to do, and not just with the CBAM, deforestation, CSDDD, forced labor. Where were the third countries in this discussion? Sure, there was some discussion, there's a better regulation, totally agree, but that was not enough in the sense of taking into account the repercussions that it will gonna have. So just to conclude, exactly, US together, not just the US or the EU, US together, plus other countries, developed countries, to then bring forward all together the developing countries.
Then I would also as a question to you, building on that, then if we move forward with this cooperation among, let's say, the more ambitious like-minded countries, how can they ensure to include the perspective of the developing countries in this greening of the climate, the greening of the trade agenda, but also ensuring that climate ambition is advanced more and more globally? How can we ensure that it's not, again, a discussion among industrialized countries, but that other perspectives are included in a better way?
Thanks. So I'll just react to a few points because everyone really touched upon it, and about the global carbon system, which would be the ideal world, and with you, it's nowhere close to it. And the WTO is trying to do it. She started this task force on global carbon pricing, which it raises a number of questions, is getting no traction, but it tries to set up a carbon price depending on the level of development of a country. But then it runs into the same old issues. Where does China fall? So I don't think it's going anywhere. So I think in my perspective, I do agree that there is a need for maybe clubs of like-minded countries to discuss things as harmonization, methodologies, how to measure emissions, stuff that are not agreed upon. And well, of course, the EU in this regard has an advantage because there is this first mover disadvantage of going first and getting all of this backlash. But there's also this disadvantage of now it's in everyone's interest to align with the EU. So I think maybe sectoral clubs like Steel Club. I think the biggest issue with the EU-US club is that it comes across as the EU is trying to get its way out of CBAM, or exemption is then you give an exemption to your like-minded countries, and that's very, very problematic. And I think this would be the biggest issue with the CBAM implementation, right? These equivalences, this discussion bilaterally that the EU will start having to have, because the CBAM might be WTO compatible and everyone seems to agree with that, but the implementation might not be. What kind of efforts do you recognize? Like now the EU will come up with the implementing act of what is an effective carbon price. What kind of efforts will be recognized? What if you don't have a carbon price? Because I think the problem with recognizing objectives is that it's harder to measure, because carbon is already hard to measure. But then if you think, okay, this subsidy will lead to that climate outcome, I mean, how do you, it's very complicated. But then at the same time, is it fair to ask India to have the same carbon price as the EU? It raises several questions. And I think how it will be implemented in practice will be, first, the EU has to step up this climate diplomacy effort, and maybe this task force is the way to go, depending on how it's approached, because if it's approached as, let me teach you how to implement the EU methodology, probably will not work out. even though, again, like it might be in the other countries' interest to align, but then it shouldn't be seen as unilateral. I mean, I know nothing about how to measure carbon, but as far as I understand, there's several ways in how we can do it. So bilaterally, and then multilaterally, what I meant was not like an international agreement, because I really think it's out of reach, but to have a platform. And I mean, I really don't know if the WTO has a role to play. I mean, several countries are blocking the discussion, so I don't think it will happen anytime soon. But I think what we propose at Europe Jack the Lock, which I don't think will happen anytime soon, but in the ideal world would be a comparability forum at the WTO where countries would sit and compare measures. And then eventually it would lead to compatibility, you know? But again, I think I am still quite optimist. I see like a movement started. If you follow the WTO submissions, more and more countries, including the US, China, make constructive submissions as asking for the WTO Secretary to step up its game. But yeah, I think it's a combination of bilateral diplomacy and multilaterally to also like proceed this road. But I know we're running out of time.
Everything in trade is unilateral, you know.
Yeah.
IRA is
unilateral.
Is unilateral, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On that matter, I wanted to ask you this question anyway. For looking forward for the EU, should it continue sort of its unilateral strategy in greening trade, not just in climate, but also all the other matters that we spoke before, thinking about the deforestation law, corporate sustainability reporting, or should it sort of tone down its ambition and sort of try to be a bit more flexible towards partners? Or is it really now, given the challenges we're facing ahead, is it the time for the EU to maybe even push harder and try to advance ambition globally through its unilateral measures?
I don't think there is really an alternative to the unilateralism, because if we end up in multilateral discussions on all of these issues, nothing will move anymore. That's the point. We are the front runner. I think with some countries, discussions probably will be easier, especially those with which we have trade agreements. For example, with Japan, you could sort that out. Yeah. Probably also with Korea, although that would already be a little bit more difficult. But for example, you don't have a free trade agreement with the United States. Huh? No. And we are further away from it than any time in the past. We have a free trade agreement with Canada, and then that's also an important part with respect to these 6, let's say, commodities that have been would be affected by CBAM. But the only way is it is unilateralism. I don't see a way out. I mean, the deforestation. I mean, it's a European regulation that we are putting into practice, and that's why deforestation, especially in Asia, has stopped. A little bit less in Latin America, but hopefully that will change as well. So, I mean, if you are a front runner, automatically you are taking unilateral measures. If not, you would never have become the front runner, no?
It's how you do it.
Excuse me?
I think it's how you do it. I agree with you, like several of these measures would never come into force. Deforestation, CBAM, you name it. I think what countries are questioning more now is really how to do it, you know. But yeah, maybe back then there was no.
They're also the only ones that in the end supported the Tokyo round, huh? Yeah. You're the only ones.
Yeah. But at the same time, if I can just comment on this, like especially on these global challenges, you need others to follow you. Yeah. You need others to follow you. So I think I agree that sometimes you need a multilateral approach, but it's like what is the balance that you manage to strike into this unilateral approach? It's like I just impose my way of doing things and viewing things and my assessment of the issue, or can I exactly, as we've been discussing so far, mitigate that imposing approach, let's say, and try to bring still going ahead with my regulatory objectives, because it's that we're still like a sovereign country, so obviously that remains valid and legitimate. But like, how can we do it in a way that then doesn't exactly create backlash, doesn't defeat the objectives in the end of the day, which is not the case of CBAM per se, but like in general, doesn't affect my reputation as well. If I want others to follow, I need my reputation. And exactly sustainable also in the long term. I think especially as the European Union, we've been very comfortable in putting out all these measures because we know we have the Brussels effects, we have our market. Well, that's shrinking very, very quickly. That kind of weight that we have in this discussion is less and less important. So people And tomorrow they will say exactly all these regulations. Well, then it's not worth it. The European market is not worth it. I'll go to China. I'll go to Southeast Asia, and so on. So I do agree. I think the thing that you should be doing is have a much more like, let's say, mitigated balance approach, and still pursue also the more plurilateral, bilateral, multilateral approach, and not just like go my way with a unilateral. It's just a balance that was lacking a little, plus the accumulation of these approach happening in so many different.
It will only be a broader discussion if we manage to convince the global community that in any case we are going to do it.
Yeah.
That's but it's a completely, I mean, it's a very interesting discussion. For example, with respect to China and so on, what should be our position, and then relation between the United States and Europe. I mean, the weight of our market, I think the weight of our market is increasing because you have, for example, China, they need to trade, you know. China cannot survive without trade, and they are in a less and less fortunate position with respect to the US. So there is an opening for Europe to work with China on this. I mean, so that's, then you get into the global picture, that's something else.
Yeah.
But to make things move, I think the only way as a first mover is that you move, no? But I really have to leave now. A very interesting discussion, but if not, somebody else will be before a closed door.
Thank you very much for.
Thank you very much.
It was great to have you. And then, Professor Nupara, do you still have anything to add? Otherwise, I think we would just some final closing thoughts.
Not too much. I really enjoyed the discussion. It was fabulous. Thank you.
Great. Thank you much. It was very great to have you from so far. Thank you very much for joining us today. And then also thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Claudia, for joining us today. And of course, all those online and in the room. Thank you very much for the discussion. I wish we had more times for questions, but maybe those still here can do. And then those joining online, thanks very much. It was great to have you here. And thanks also for the organizers in the background that made this possible, and for inviting me to chair this session. It was very interesting and lots of food for thought for the upcoming discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.